You know, if Descartes was alive today, he'd have a grill. Cubic zirconium on the top and rose gold on the bottom. He'd have a fat green hat with a big ostrich feather on the side. He'd be a pimp like you've never seen before. He was in France in the early 17th century. Now, most people don't think that. But that's the case. Descartes was a pimp. He was a brawler, a drunk, a lout, a trust fund baby, hardcore Catholic genocidalist. So this is your lovable Descartes. He's in every major university, every major philosophy department. And he's actually determined almost every single person's identity in this room. Sure, it was Kurt Cobain, it was Tupac. Or it was Eddie Vedder. Or if it was the Smiths. Or if it was various other countercultural references that I'm sure everyone in their mind right now is running through what they identified with. It might have been Cartesian. Most people probably didn't find Descartes to be fascinating in the mathematics room. But in reality, he was more or less a cultural condition. And he was the condition that created the potential for fascism. What you reference today, the synarchism, this whole French condition that we're constantly referencing. Well, Descartes was made up. He was created by hardcore Catholic genocidalists. And some of this stuff is still kind of maybe debatable. I don't know all the specifics in the background, so we're not going to cover that a lot tonight. But there's really no other way you could explain someone who's as degenerate as this to become so hegemonic 400 years after their death. Or about 350. Just couldn't do it. The question is, how did it happen? And who was he? What was he doing? How many people here have read Descartes? Discourse on Method, Principles of Philosophy, his 6 Meditations. All right, we're going to look at some of it tonight. But there really is. There's been a cultural impact. Who here has ever heard of the book called The Plague by Albert Camus? But you know how it ends? Who remembers how that book ends? Does the plague get cured? No, not everyone. Well, no, not everyone dies. The plague is cured, right? But the guy who was so happy during the midst of the plague, as soon as the plague gets cured, becomes an assassin and ends up killing himself. The plague's cured, he kills himself. That's Descartes. So, the basis for modern existentialism, the current kind of condition right now, the tendency for the Democratic Party to be influential by a guy named Felix Rohatyn, you could blame Descartes. And it's a question of, how do you know something? I think it was that fun. Yeah, that's the new space mission by JPL called Descartes. Oh, wait. I'll give it to you guys and I got up mine. And this is the principled fight right now on both sides. You have a tendency for you have synarchism. You have a push for fascism. You have a population which has become demoralized. They have had a right-wing reaction to a cultural degeneracy since the 1960s. And in response to that, as we right now are leading the fight to overturn what's taken place over the last 30 years, what's that mean? In the Democratic Party, and creating a paradigm shift right now in American politics. The threat we're facing, after we say defeat Alito and defeat this kind of push by the right wing, is organizing the solution amongst Democrats, amongst our own party, amongst people who recognize the political problems we're facing, that they themselves have been influenced by a philosophical problem. Why not just build some infrastructure, some state debt, Why doesn't that function? How did it become... You have to think a little bit about how did it become institutionalized that human beings can't think? If by nature your existence is based on thought, how is it that human beings came to think so irrationally? Was it inevitable? Are we building from the ground up? Are we slowly improving our condition? Step by step? We're just going to get smarter and smarter. We're going to figure some of these things out slowly but surely. Has the process been just constantly improving each year a little bit more? How has the historical process really functioned? So, now, the, I just had it. I wish I knew how to use this thing. This year might seem familiar to many people in the room right now. Let's pull this up. Who knows what happened in 1596? Of historical significance. You shout it out if you know.
Kepler published the work we're now reading.
All right, there you go. Mysterium Cosmographicum. All right. Same year Descartes born. So he lives in the wake of Kepler. Right? He dies 1650.
Who does?
This is Descartes. Yeah. Now, we're going to look at somebody else tonight, too. But he was far from a pimp, though he definitely had a hairdo. Of Leibniz. Now, Descartes proposes he's going to develop a new method. A method to revolutionize human thought. And it's only fair to Descartes. I figured the best way to actually dig into him was to find out what he wrote, what he said, present that, and begin to investigate what were the approach that he took towards the question of, say, what now is considered force. The notion of force has changed historically. To what now in most textbooks and most classrooms you get it equals mass times acceleration. But the way they were dealing with it then was less kind of conclusive in that sense. So there's a debate of how do you approach motion? How do you approach change within physical phenomena? What's determining that change? How do you measure it? And you get a specific thing with Descartes. You get a specific thing that's developing right now during this period of time with Kepler. It's what LaRouche has brought up in his books, one of which in particular, the In Defense of Common Sense, where you're going to be looking at not structure. So what I'm looking for. Where just slipped my mind. It's two things in a logical argument. There's substance and form. Yeah, thank you. So two things, form and substance. And anybody can steal form. That's what's stolen. And that's why you have to recognize that when Descartes was born in 1596, everything we're going to read, and there's a certain quote we can look at. But really think, he's born during this period of time. He's born in the period of Kepler. He's born in a time of religious conflict, right? So that just to keep the overall general frame. So let's just kind of see. So his principled work, and we'll get into his biography a little bit, is a discourse on method. and it was written in 1637 or 1636. Now Descartes, around 17, he finished high school. He was educated by the Jesuits. His father was what they call some type of former nobility, just a wealthy family, high standards. And he decided that after his finishing relative high school, he'd go on he'd join the religious wars. And he started fighting. And he came back to Paris for a while. He'd get drunk. He'd womanize. He became the D'Artagnan, if people know the Three Musketeers. He became the D'Artagnan of Paris. And he just basically presented himself as a real intellectual, the smartest guy on the block. Both a name for himself and a certain egotistical name. And in the course of the developments, he was basically certain people from his education. This guy Marcin, one of these guys named Cardinal Bérulle happens to pick him up. And this is, I couldn't find anything on Bérulle except commentary, but the commentary was intriguing enough. This is a book called Cogito Ergo Sum by Richard Watson, The Life of René Descartes. And this is obviously just one person's opinion, but just give you a sense of where Descartes' publications came from. This is what he says. He says, it's kind of a convoluted argument, because he's referencing how certain people are saying one thing in Descartes' biographical period of time, and now he's saying that I'm challenging this because I think they had other reasons why they were saying it. It wasn't necessarily true. But this is the overall debate of who is influencing Descartes. He says, here goes. He does not say he had a private conversation with Bérulle. He merely includes Bérulle in the company he spoke to. He says they encouraged him to write up his ideas. But people had already been doing that for years. So Clercellier and Ballet probably thought, these are two individuals that are around Descartes, his kind of associates, why not spin it out to a private talk with Bérulle? Clercellier was a devout. He was said to go to Mass more than any man in Paris, and he fervently supported Bérulle's totalitarian aspiration for the Catholic League. So Ballet was the first guy that wrote a biography of Descartes. I know this is really kind of not the most clear of ideas right now. But he says, this is Watson. He says, what a good idea to have Cardinal Bérulle set Descartes on his life's way. These are the two best friends with Descartes. These are two of the people that are espousing his ideas throughout France. People who are helping to infiltrate universities throughout France, throughout Europe, to teach Descartes' so-called method. It was what a good idea to have Cardinal Bérulle set Descartes on his life's way. Then Descartes would have an acceptable reason for going to the United Provinces, which was Holland, where he did all of his writing. He leaves France at 35 years old and spends the rest of his life, 35, and spends the rest of his life in Holland. So for 20 years, France's greatest philosopher does every single one of his published writings in Holland, a non-Catholic area. But he's a hardcore Catholic. And he says, then Descartes would have an acceptable reason for going to the United Provinces. He references this guy Beekman, a nobody. The significant, important man in Descartes' life had to be a somebody. The members of the Saint Descartes Protection Society began to refer to Cardinal Bérulle as Descartes' director of conscience. Listen to what he says. That genocidal maniac, and I speak precisely, as Descartes' director of conscience, not bloody likely. Descartes did not want to eliminate Protestants and Protestantism. Some of his best friends were Protestants. He got along with them very well. Right? So this is one of the biographers. Now, I always find it intriguing just to present it. Just because for the very fact is, why if you were in love with Descartes, why would you even have to address? Why would there even be a discussion that Descartes' main supporters were Catholic genocidalists?
Who was this guy?
Cardinal Berulle. There's not a lot about him except that's all written by the church, and it's all halfway good. He basically was in fights. He was the guy that supported this group called the Jansenists. It's a lot of peripheral stuff that we could dig into as far as the investigation of history. But this stuff's never that easy. It's never simple. Now, I just want to present that just to give people some sense. Like, there's a lot of work to be done on some of these things. But let's dive into what Descartes had to say. This is Descartes' first work. Actually, it's his second. The first one, he supposedly wrote on, it was called Le Monde, or The World. And he wrote it, much like a lot of the texts that were getting written after Kepler, about just how the whole world could now be understood. You could use a method to investigate plants, anatomy, geography, the moon, Mars, the solar system. And he had this huge text that encompassed the entire universe, the world. But he didn't publish it because, as the story goes, Galileo got persecuted for supporting the Copernican system. And so he decided not to print it. He didn't want to cause the church, his words, he didn't want to cause the church to have to commit another sin. So this is his discourse on method. It's used predominantly to be the basis of what Descartes was lining out as a new scientific method. But he'll reference it after the fact as kind of this biographical fable and story and tale of his own experiences. And he wasn't trying to teach anybody anything. He just wanted to share his thoughts on life. But this is one of his most principled works. So what I've taken is excerpts from the major section, and some of it might be familiar to people. And we're just going to read through it. Because otherwise I found it difficult that if people aren't familiar with Descartes, how could you show the flaw? You could show what he supposedly said. And we'll get into this. We'll get into a specific argument that Leibniz was having at the time, in the late 1600s. But first you have to know where Descartes is coming from. So I need people to volunteer. Preferably up front, I guess, so the mic can catch it. But anybody that speaks loud. Does anybody want to read?
I'll read.
All right.
That is why I thought it necessary to search for some other method. And since the multiplicity of laws often provides excuses for vices, so that a state is much better ruled when it has but very few laws, and when these are very strictly observed, likewise, in place of the large number of precepts of which logic is composed, I believed that the following 4 rules would be sufficient for me, provided I made a firm and constant resolution not even once to fail to observe them. The first was never to accept anything as true that I did not plainly know to be such. That is to say, carefully to avoid hasty judgment and prejudice, and to include nothing more in my judgments than what presented itself to my mind so clearly and so distinctly that I had no occasion to call it in doubt. The second, to divide each of the difficulties I would examine into as many parts as possible, and as was required in order to better resolve them. The third, to conduct my thoughts in an orderly fashion, by commencing with those objects that are simplest and easiest to know, in order to ascend little by little, as by degrees, to the knowledge of the most composite things, and by supposing an order even among those things that do not naturally precede one another. And the last, everywhere to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I was assured of having omitted nothing.
Okay. So, I don't know if people caught that. you have a sense of what he was just going through there? There wasn't much of a lead up into it. So he's setting out in 1619. So I guess he's about 23 years old. He was out with the armies on a night called St. Martin's Eve. And he was drunk as hell. And he finds himself in some type of sauna or some type of back room where he supposedly had a vision. And this is the story of how it goes. Right? This is his epiphany. And he had three dreams. The first was of the wind blowing and him getting blown by the wind. The second dream was of the wind blowing and him standing, watching the wind blow. And the third, a poem in Latin asking, which life would you lead? And so it was, he's 23, so it's about 15 or 16 years later that he actually begins to write. Between then and now, he just continues to live the most more or less degenerate kind of lifestyle throughout Paris, fighting in various religious wars, getting papal blessings, watching the coronation of the emperor of the Palatinate. So he's just basically going through his four basic rules. This is his method. He just read Descartes' method. This is the essence of Descartes' revolutionary method of scientific approach. Should we read it again?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
What was the second one? You got blown by the wind, and then what?
And he watched the wind blow.
Watch the wind blow.
What?
Would you say in a sauna?
Somebody want to read?
That is why I thought it necessary to search for some other method. And since the multiplicity of laws often provides excuses for vices, so that a state is much better ruled when it has but very few laws, and when these are very strictly observed. Likewise, in place of the large number of precepts of which logic is composed, I believe that the following four rules would be sufficient for me, provided I made a firm and constant resolution not even once to fail to observe them. The first was, never to accept anything as true that I did not plainly know to be such. That is to say, carefully to avoid hasty judgment and prejudice, and to include nothing more in my judgments than what presented itself to my mind so clearly and so distinctly that I had no occasion to call it in doubt. The second, to divide each of the difficulties I would examine into as many parts as possible and as was required in order to better resolve them. The third, to conduct my thoughts in an orderly fashion by commencing with those objects that are simplest and easiest to know, in order to ascend little by little, as by degrees, to the knowledge of the most composite things, and by supposing an order even among those things that do not naturally precede one another. And last, everywhere to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I was assured of having omitted nothing.
All right, so that's his groundbreaking method.
Does he say that the order is just basically something that precedes another thing? Or?
Oh, and the third one?
Yeah, the third.
An orderly fashion. I think you'll get a better sense if we keep reading what he... The implications come out more. All right, so now he goes on. That's the substance of the second part of the first part. He goes through his dreams and what led up to this point. That's his new method. There's 6 parts in sum to the discourse, and then he wrote a number of scientific treatises, dioptrics, one on geography, these kinds of things, following it to give examples of his new method. But this is what's principally used because most of that stuff was obviously useless. So this is now he's going to discuss how he spent the next, after he had these dreams and he realized that this was the method he was going to take in his life. He discussed what was his plan, right? Who here has had an epiphany of some sort after getting really fucked up? You're gonna change your life, right?
Oh yeah.
Things are gonna be a lot better. You're gonna shape things differently now. This year is gonna be completely different. Right. So he sets out, and of course he's got a method now. So he sets out to. He's going to set out how he's going to approach then. What's going to be his mode of conduct? How is he going to operate now from this standpoint? Now having to apply this method with everything that he does. So this is the substance of part 3.
So too, in order not to remain irresolute in my actions while reason required me to be so in my judgments, and in order not to cease to live happily as possible during this time, I formulated a provisional code of morals, which consisted of but 3 or 4 maxims, which I very much want to share with you. The first was to obey the laws and the customs of my country, constantly holding on to the religion in which, by God's grace, I had been instructed from my childhood, and governing myself in everything else according to the most moderate opinions and those furthest from excess. Opinions that were commonly accepted and practiced by the most judicious of those with whom I would have to live. And among many opinions that are equally accepted, I would choose only the most moderate, not only because they're always the most suitable for practical affairs, and probably the best, every excess usually being bad, but also so as to stray less from the true path, in case I should be mistaken that if I had chose one of the 2 extremes, when it was the other one I should have followed. My second maxim was to be as firm and resolute in my actions as I could, and to follow the most doubtful opinions. Okay, yes. My second maxim was to be as firm and resolute in my actions as I could, and to follow the most doubtful opinions once I had decided on them.
Hold on.
Yeah, it seems somewhat.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Wait. Where are we? Oh, you can go. You can finish that.
With no less constancy than if they had been very well assured. And thus the actions of life often tolerating no delay, it is a very certain truth that when it is not in our powers to discern the truest opinions, we must follow the most probable. And even if we notice no more probability in some than in others, nevertheless we must settle on some, and afterwards no longer regard them as doubtful, insofar as they relate to practical matters, but as very true and very certain, because the reason that made us decide on them appears so.
I'm gonna read you what I excerpted out, because I didn't have a lot of time to write everything in. The part that was in between the ellipses. He says, "In this I would be imitating travelers who, finding themselves lost in some forest, should not wander about turning this way and that, nor worse still stop in one place, but should always walk in as straight a line as they can in one direction, and never change it for feeble reasons, even if at the outset it had perhaps been only chance that made them choose it. For by this means, even if they are not going exactly where they wish, at least they will eventually arrive somewhere, where they will probably be better off than in the middle of a forest."
Yes.
Better off than somewhere in the
My third maxim My third maxim was always try to conquer myself rather than fortune, and to change my desires rather than the order of the world, and generally to accustom myself to believing that there is nothing that is completely within our power except our thoughts, so that after we have done our best regarding things external to us, everything that is lacking for us to succeed is, from our point of view, absolutely impossible. And this alone seemed to me sufficient to prevent me in the future from desiring anything but what I was to acquire, and thus to make me contented.
Okay. Now the extras. For our will tending by nature to desire only what our understanding represents to it as somehow possible, it is certain that if we consider all the goods that are outside us as equally beyond our power, we will have no more regrets about lacking those that seem owed to us as our birthright when we are deprived of them through no fault of our own, than we have in not possessing the kingdoms of China or Mexico, and that, making a virtue of necessity, as they say, we shall no more desire to be healthy if we are sick, or to be free if we are in prison, than we now do to have a body made of a material as incorruptible as diamonds, or wings to fly like birds.
Finally, to conclude this code of morals, I took it upon myself to review the various occupations that men have in this life, in order to try to choose the best one, and not wanting to say anything about the occupations of others. I thought I could not do better than to continue in that very one in which I found myself. That is to say, spending my whole life cultivating my reason and advancing, as far as I could, in the knowledge of truth, following the method I had prescribed to myself. And in the 9 years that followed, I did nothing but wander here and there in the world, trying to be more a spectator than an actor in all the comedies that are played out there, and reflecting particularly in each matter on what might render it suspect and give us occasion for erring. I meanwhile rooted out from my mind all the errors. I rooted out from my mind all the errors that had previously been able to slip into it. Nevertheless,
just keep in mind this is about 1620 to 1629, in the middle of Europe.
Damn. Nevertheless, those 9 years slipped by before I had as yet taken any stand regarding the difficulties commonly debated among learned men, or had begun to seek the foundations of any philosophy that was more certain than the commonly accepted one.
Right. So now he goes on to the bulk of his philosophy, and since the second part, there's two major things he picks up, which kind of give him some level of. He doesn't say, everything he says isn't horrible. Obviously, anybody has a horrible or just a kind of corrupted and degenerate way of thinking doesn't necessarily think everything bad about the world. So the two things he bases his philosophy on are the immortality of the soul and the existence of God. But so we're going to look at the first part, which is his argument, or at least the beginning part of his argument for the immortality of the soul. And this is the part people are going to be somewhat familiar with, maybe.
Judging that I was just as prone to error as any other, I rejected as false all the reasonings that I had previously taken for demonstrations. And finally, considering the fact that all the same thoughts we have when we are awake can also come to us when we are asleep, without any of them being true, I resolved to pretend that all the things that had ever entered my mind were no more true than the illusions of my dreams. But immediately afterward, I noticed that, while I wanted thus to think that everything was false, it necessarily had to be the case that I, who was thinking this, was something, and noticing that this truth, But immediately afterward, I noticed that, while I wanted thus to think that everything was false, it necessarily had to be the case that I, who was thinking this, was something. And noticing that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so firm and so assured that all the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics were incapable of shaking it, I judged that I could accept it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. Then, examining with attention what I was, and seeing that I could pretend that I had no body, and that there was no world, nor any place where I was, I could not pretend, on that account, that I did not exist at all, and that, on the contrary, from the very fact that I thought of doubting the truth of other things, it followed very evidently and very certainly that I existed. Whereas, on the other hand, had I simply stopped thinking, even if all the rest of what I had ever imagined had been true, I would have had no reason to believe that I had existed. From this I knew that I was a substance, the whole essence or nature of which is simply to think, and which, in order to exist, has no need of any place nor depends on any material thing. Thus, this is to say, the soul through which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body, and is even easier to know than the body. And even if there were no body at all, it would not cease to be all that it is.
We're going to look at that idea in a second. But first, his best student was a woman named Princess Elizabeth, who was just kind of mostly a hardcore materialist. And she was the princess of the Palatinate. So, again, you can notice the dates and some of this stuff. But this will give someone a sense of the kind of dialogue Descartes was having with his student. And then we can discuss some of where the flaw really exists, regardless of maybe what seems to be just absurd. But obviously, this statement, I think, therefore I am, has had huge repercussions on our society today. We all know, right? From Bill and Ted's Adventure or something. All right, so someone else want to read this, and then we'll...
Descartes and Princess Elizabeth. Elizabeth writes June 20th, 1643, I hope I can use that domestic duties as an excuse for my stupidity in not being able to understand the idea by which we are supposed to decide how the mind, which is neither extended nor material, can move the body, by comparison with the idea you formerly had of heaviness. I confess that it would be easier for me to attribute matter and extension to the soul than to attribute the ability to move a body and to be moved by a body to an immaterial thing. Being. Descartes' reply.
Hold on.
In the first place, then, I notice a great difference between these three kinds of notion, because the soul is conceivable only by pure understanding. The body, that is, extension, shapes, and movements, may also be conceived by pure understanding on its own, but it can be conceived much better by the understanding assisted by the imagination. And finally, things that pertain to the union of the soul and body are known only obscurely by the understanding on its own, or even by the understanding assisted by imagination. But they are known very clearly by the senses. That is why those who never philosophize and use only their senses have no doubt that the soul moves the body and the body acts on the soul.
People catch that? What you just said?
Yeah.
Seeing the senses, you only know the body. Like the senses can tell everything about the connection between the body and the soul.
I can also say, truthfully, that the main rule that followed in my study and the rule that I followed in my study and the rule that I believe has helped me most to acquire some knowledge is that I never gave more than a few hours a day to thoughts that occupy the imagination, and very few hours a year to thoughts that occupy the understanding on its own. I spend all the rest of my time in relaxing the senses and reposing my mind. But I thought that more than thoughts that require less attention, these meditations were responsible. Meditations, were responsible for making you find obscure the notion we have of the union of mind and body, because it seemed to me that the human mind is incapable of conceiving very distinctly and simultaneously both the distinction and union of body and soul. The reason is that in order to do so, it would be necessary to conceive of them as one single thing, and at the same time to conceive of them as two things, which is self-contradictory. However, since Your Highness suggests that it is easier to attribute matter and extension to the soul than to attribute to the soul the ability to move and to be moved by a body without having any matter itself, I beseech you to take the liberty to attribute this matter and extension to the soul. For that is nothing more than conceiving of its own notion of the body.
Union.
Of its union with the body. In this way, Your Highness will easily recover your knowledge of the distinction between the soul and the body, despite the fact that you conceive of their union.
I'm not sure. Was that clear?
Yeah, I think
It's clear.
Not really. Could you clear it up a little bit?
Just read. Just have one more person read it.
Oh, yeah. From what?
I can do from, I guess, from what I thought.
But I thought that more than thoughts that require less attention, these meditations were responsible for making you find obscure the notion we have of the union of mind and body. Because it seemed to me that the human mind is incapable of conceiving very distinctly and simultaneously both the distinction and union of body and soul. The reason is that in order to do so, it would be necessary to conceive of them as one single thing, and at the same time to conceive of them as two things, which is self-contradictory. However, since Your Highness suggests that it is easier to attribute matter and extension to the soul than attribute to the soul the ability to move and to be moved by a body without having any matter itself, I beseech you to take the liberty to attribute this matter and extension to the soul, for that is nothing more than conceiving of its union with the body. In this way, Your Highness will easily recover your knowledge of the distinction between the soul and the body, despite the fact that you conceive of their union.
Can we read Elizabeth's letter again?
Oh, yeah, that's really short. People see what he just said that.
The last part?
I hope that I can use that as an excuse for my stupidity and not being able to understand the idea by which we are supposed to decide how the mind, which is neither extended nor material, can move the body. By comparison with the idea you formerly had of heaviness, I confess it would be easier for me to attribute matter and extension to the soul than to attribute the ability to move a body and to be moved by a body to an immaterial being.
It's a bit more subtle than the absurdities before.
Yeah, can you go back down to that?
Yeah, sure. If you notice what he's done, it's pretty salty. It says, however, since your highness suggested that it is easier to attribute matter and extension to the soul than to attribute to the soul the ability to move, and to be moved by a body without having any matter itself, I beseech you to take the liberty to attribute this matter and extension to the soul. For that is nothing more than conceiving of its union with the body, and in this way your highness will easily recover your knowledge of the distinction between the soul and the body, despite the fact that you conceive of their union. All right. This will be more clear.
It is easy to prove that the pleasure of the soul, which constitutes happiness, is not inseparable from the pleasure and comfort of the body, either by reference to tragedies that please us more in proportion to the amount of sadness they excite in us, or by reference to bodily exercises, such as hunting, tennis, and so on, which are pleasant despite being very painful. One even sees that it is often the fatigue and pain which increase the pleasure they cause. The source of the pleasure that the soul gets from these exercises consists in the fact that they make it aware of the strength, skill, or some other perfection of the body with which it is united.
Okay. The lights show? What's that?
No, this one was cognitive person.
So this is supposedly the epitome of Western thought. And so that we'll see in quotes later that Leibniz takes up his principal task in life to some extent is to rid Western Europe institutions from, or just European institutions in general, from the Descartes' influence. It was hegemonic to a large extent. But there's a funny characteristic that if you begin to understand some of the characteristics of a statement like this, you begin to see the importance of what LaRouche has really done. And just take a minute to dig into it since we've got Descartes on the ropes. So if we translate this, I'm going to translate it in kind of I usually see this I am, but basically the same idea. Is there an E here? Is there an E at the end of therefore? Yeah. Okay. So there's two things. The big thing that Descartes is known for is what's called analytical geometry. And if you want to show what that is, that's what you got in your algebra class with a parabola, a Cartesian grid.
Oh.
Yeah, that was his big breakthrough. He decided to apply algebra to geometry, and that was what was so revolutionary. That's what brought the new age of modern mathematical physics, was your algebra class in 7th grade. But there's something more interesting here. And it comes down to, if you get in, when you begin to look at it, like formal logic, you find that this statement has all the kinds of the footing to begin kind of investigating what really Descartes was doing and what the fraud really was. And that's what, if you know the fraud, then you know where to address, you know where to attack. right? You know what to introduce that's gonna solve the problem philosophically. Because this itself seems to be relatively cognitive for our culture today, right? So if most people walked around saying this, it would seem to be a better world, right? If they identified themselves as existing because they thought rather than... But here's the funny thing. Now, now Descartes, he classifies it, but just take the statement in and of itself. Couldn't I put anything here? Couldn't I put X? Anything? Therefore, X exists? Would it still be a true statement?
Yeah.
No, but he's saying thinking.
Yeah, he's saying thinking, right? But we're investigating just the structure, because the structure there's something about the structure that he's put it in. His whole idea is to refute that the people that kind of dominate the academic environment were the scholastics, and so they're just Aristotelians. It's all syllogisms, and it's all just logic, and so he wants to refute this.
If you put like something that the thing X does, you basically say that it exists.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any verb.
Any action.
Any action. Right. Any verb. You couldn't put X blue in. That wouldn't make sense, but right. Or if it was the other blue, I guess. So, because you put it into a structure. Now, this word right here it says something about the statement, though. Because the way it's already set up, it has to be logically consistent. If X is any action, then of course X has to exist. Does that mean it really exists? X, squirts, purple juice, that's worth millions of dollars out of its butt. Therefore, X exists. It's like, does that mean that thing, whatever that does that, exists? Not necessarily, right? So there's a statement here which you're saying. Therefore, you're saying it really exists in reality. I've said that because you could easily do this. You could say X blue implies, or we'll say blows, implies X exists. And the statement still, it's true. And now you're more logic. Now you're just referencing it's not necessarily pertaining to the physical universe. You're saying it's a logically consistent statement. That's true. If X does something, then something has to exist to do what it's doing. And now you're more specific that it's merely a logical statement. And that's the form. But Freddie's right. Descartes uses think. So now we're dealing with substance. Because the way Descartes reads this, and this is worthwhile reading, this section of the discourse on method is worthwhile reading. Because Larouche references this in Beyond Psych, he references it in Defense of Common Sense. And but now you're then at a point of substance. How does Descartes think? How do most people think? Are most people determining the next thought they're having? Are you? Are your thoughts largely determined based on the buildup of thoughts and events and reactions you've had up until that point? Are you actively thinking? Is there some I independent of what's just a mere kind of a reactionary system? Exists how? Is there only one kind of existence? How do you qualify the quality of existence that you participate in? And this is what Leibniz has to address. The substance. The only reason Descartes can make a statement like this is because he was born here. There's a... This is a quote. It says, although they, the stars, appear very irregularly scattered in the sky, I believe nonetheless that there is a natural order among them which is regular and fixed. And the knowledge of that order is the key and the foundation of the highest and the most perfect science that men can attain as regards material things. For by means of it one could understand a priori all the diverse forms and essences of terrestrial bodies, whereas without it we have to content ourselves with guessing at them a posteriori. I believe it is a science which surpasses human understanding, and yet I am so foolish that I cannot refrain from dreaming about it. Right? And to show you, he lists these cognizant of who he's. He says, whoever accuses me of having borrowed the ellipsis and hyperbolas of my dioptric from Kepler must be either ignorant or malicious. As concerns the ellipse, I do not recall that Kepler speaks of it. Or if he does, it is assuredly to say that it is not the anaclastic that he is seeking. And as for the hyperbola, I remember well that he expressly tries to demonstrate that it too is insufficient. Now I leave it to you to decide if I would have borrowed something from a man who tried to prove it false. And this is to his one of his controllers. This is this guy, Marin Mersenne. He represented Descartes in the Salon in Paris. This is basically his major kind of worker for the Paris networks. And the relationship with a lot of these guys is really unclear. But he says, I dare to assure you that none is false. And he's referencing a number of experiments that Mersenne was criticizing him for. Because I did them all myself. And in particular, the one you cite concerning hot water which freezes more quickly than cold. I did not say hot and cold, but rather that water which has been kept over fire for a long time freezes more quickly than that which has not. Stupid.
It's like, be this
Petulant. Actually, I'd probably just leave it down.
Is it just something like wanted to argue about? You just
What's that?
find something to argue about?
Well, the question you kind of have to ask yourself is, how do you address this problem? If someone like this just becomes just an authority, what they say has value, how do you begin to really expose it? So, yeah, this is Leibniz. (1680). Leibniz was born 2 years before the Treaty of Westphalia, and Descartes dies of pneumonia in Sweden. This like 6'5" Swedish queen, Christina, basically beats him up every morning at 5 a.m. The whole idea of Descartes is that he's notorious for sleeping in the morning. He was of ill health when he was younger, so no one ever made him get up. His father paid the schoolmaster to make sure he could sleep in whenever he wanted to. He always just laid in bed and thought. That's where all his profound ideas came from. So it's kind of a funny condition. I think he just got butt poor at the end of his life, and basically had to have the Swedish queen pay him. And she forced him to get up at 5 a.m. just so she could show her court how great she was. And eventually it was just freezing cold at 5 a.m. in these horribly stone-built libraries in Sweden. He just got pneumonia and died.
What was she doing with him? She was reading books?
I think she just was, the way they describe her is just like this physical brute of a woman who just conquered most men on horseback and hunting and just like this wild Swedish queen.
Oh, Europe.
Take me home. All right. So this is Leibniz, 1680. It's from the Precepts for Advancing the Sciences and Arts. Someone want to read this one?
When I consider that practice does not profit from the light of theory, that we do not strive to lessen the number of disputes, but to augment them, that we are content with specious augmentation instead of a serious and conclusive method, I fear we shall remain for a long time in our present confusion and indigence.
Indigence, yeah.
Indigence.
It just means poverty, basically.
Okay. Confusion and indigence through our own fault. I even fear that after uselessly exhausting curiosity without obtaining form or our investigations any considerable gain for our happiness, people may be disgusted with the sciences, and their fatal despair may cause them to fall back into barbarism.
You want to reread it? Did you get it?
Okay.
No, did you? If people want to, we can reread it.
No.
All right, so Leibniz is obviously identifying the problem in his time period. His view of Descartes is pretty clear. This will be a spirited letter for whoever reads.
I have recognized from experience that those who are completely Cartesian are not capable of discovery. There have been many beautiful discoveries since Descartes, but as far as I know, not one of them has come from a true Cartesian. This is evidence that either Descartes did not know the true method, or else he did not leave it to them. Descartes himself had a rather limited mind. He excelled all people in speculation, but he discovered nothing useful for the portion of life which falls under the senses, and nothing useful in the practice of the arts. His meditations were either too abstract, as in his metaphysics and his geometry, or too much subject to the imagination, as in his principles of natural philosophy. For science consists in knowing reasons, and the reasons for what was created by an understanding are the final causes or plans of the understanding that made them. That is why a God like Descartes allows us no consolation other than of patience through strength. Descartes has good reason to recommend, instead of felicity, patience without hope. If he had less ambition to make a sect for himself, more patience in reasoning about sensible things, and less inclination to give himself over to the invisible, he would perhaps have put forth the foundations of the true physics, for he had considerable talent necessary to succeed in this. But since he strayed from the true path, he harmed his reputation, which will not be as solid as that of Archimedes. We will soon forget the beautiful We will soon forget the beautiful novel of physics which he has given us. It is, therefore, left to posterity to start building on better foundations, incapable of being shaken.
What's that from?
That's the letter to Milanus. So who's read the Discourse on Metaphysics here? Imagine. Let's see how this is most. We're an internal meeting here. Everyone figure out the quantity of motion problem then? No? Okay. So that's what we're gonna go through that to see if we can make ends of. What's that?
We were going to do an experiment with the banana last time.
What's that?
We were going to do an experiment with the banana last time.
With a banana?
Yeah.
What are we going to do with the banana?
We were going to test the quantity of motion on it.
Uh-huh. How?
Or a car.
You're going to throw it?
That was going to be the second one.
The car and the bullet.
Yeah.
We were going to shoot it with a rifle.
Yeah. Hit it with a car?
Or at least throw it.
I think it would be best to use. And build a pendulum.
Oh, isn't there one in like the
A pendulum? You can probably build a pendulum. The pendulum? This here? Does that work as a pendulum?
Well, you need to have a string with a weight, that's all.
Actually, I think I did see a wooden one. The thing with the little orange ball that swings back and forth. It's the same radius. That's not a pendulum. No, it's not.
That's a cycloidal pendulum.
It's a pendulum, just not a.
We need some string. We have those plaster of Paris balls. The problem I always have with the experiments is that it's a different kind of investment. Has everyone played with the pendulum before? You know,
Never seen it.
somewhat yes or no.
No.
It's always kind of no. Maybe we should get a bunch of pendulums and just build them or something. It's 9:30. Because it's kind of a funny task in dealing with the experimental stuff they're dealing with, because they're assuming no friction and no types of things in that sense. So everything you try will come out kind of fuzzy. People know the argument Leibniz makes. Let's go with the argument first, and then we'll get into the experiments. We can experiment later.
But it's not true that mass times.
Yeah, the Cartesians. This is explicit out of the Discourse on Metaphysics, but the Cartesians have this idea called the quantity of motion. And Descartes, he might have some work explicitly on this task. He definitely has some work in regards to optics. People have heard the refraction process in water. That comes up a lot. Descartes got a theory on that as well. But Leibniz addresses this question, the quantity of motion. Where they say that if you want to figure out you can call it, I guess you call it force, or say that in physics they might call it the kinetic energy. Put it this way: the ability to make an impact, the potential for effect of, say, an object moving. How do we measure that the potential for effect?
Mass times acceleration, is that?
That's what they say today for force, right? That's the typical. There's a question of how much, if I throw this pen, like what's the potential for this pen, how much could this pen hurt you, right? As a function of the pen itself, how heavy it might be. Do I throw with my left hand or with my right? Right, which arm do I throw with? And so the Cartesians come up with the idea that if you take mass times velocity, they say if we take the mass of the object, in this case say its weight, and how fast it's going, which are two obvious conditions to the object. From their standpoint, they're obvious conditions. That will determine the impact of the pen when it hits you. Potential for effect. How much work can it accomplish? How big is the bruise? Now, it comes from a science called mechanics. This is a lot of this is done by Archimedes. One of the things was the lever. That if I go cut this into Archimedes had worked out for certain static relationships of physical events. Such things that if I have a lever, then I can apply 1 pound of pressure 3 feet from the fulcrum of that lever. I can balance that 1 pound at 3 feet with a 3 pound object at 1 foot. And obviously just have a relationship of distance and weight. So the Cartesians applied just a similar conception. But you'll run into funny problems when dealing with an object moving through space. And Leibniz addresses this at the end. But we'll get at some of those questions after we get through the argument. So this is how Descartes approaches the phenomena. And so if we had some object falling, yeah, right. Falling down from the gravitational field. He said the ability for impact of this object is based on how fast it hits and the size of the object. And that's pretty simple. So Leibniz says, well, maybe there's something more, though. And he poses it in a certain way. So he says, if I take, from that standpoint, if we're just assuming that we're looking at the effect an object can have based on its mass and its velocity, or its bulk, or however you want to put it, they don't necessarily use mass. It seems like we're assuming that the mass and the velocity have equal relationships. That the mass and the velocity both weigh in the same amount to the overall impact. Much like the distance and the weight with the lever. If I double this to 2 feet, then I can take 3 halves. I can take a half of the mass. So if I double the distance, I take a half of the weight. And they weigh in equally. Well, what Leibniz figures then is that if I have object A and I have object B, object A has a certain velocity. When it collides into B, based on this argument that mass and velocity will have the same, if this object is effect will be based largely just on this object's effect will be based on its mass and velocity, and this object has no condition whether to move or not to move. It's indifferent. It's merely just extension in space. Then when this object hits B, both will carry down the pathway. With a velocity of A. Because that should happen.
Why should that happen?
Because the object B is it's not, there's a,
It's just an assumption about space. It's just how.
Hey, Mike?
yeah,
You're saying the force would transfer and they would move at the same speed once they collide?
right.
Okay. So B would have no effect on A?
Yeah. That's the argument that would extend if the force of A is only based on its mass and its velocity, and the force at B, okay, yeah, because what's the force at B when it's still?
Zero.
Right. So that since you have no force at B and the force at A, so what's the total force when A and B collide? It's the sum. It's the sum of the two of them. So it maintains, let's say, a velocity of A.
But doesn't the mass subtract from the mass of A? The mass of B take away from the mass of the force of A?
Yeah, the question is, well, why?
It has mass, it has weight. Like the force just, it's not like it's floating there without any kind of gravity on it or friction.
Mm-hmm.
Its own mass.
Yeah.
I don't understand Leibniz's argument. It seems like it's just kind of
Do you see definitive?
misinterpreting what the Cartesians are saying.
I think I'm misinterpreting what Leibniz is saying.
Hey, Mike?
Yeah.
Is it just like when they don't, like we assume that we're not going to pay attention to air friction or things like that what's in this bond?
Mm-hmm.
Do they also abstract the friction that you have from the body A and body B, the density of body B, and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. I'll have to rethink this argument because I know that it does suffice to be consistent with the Cartesians. We'll come back to it afterwards.
Well, they're saying mass times velocity equals force.
Yeah.
And so if your velocity is zero,
The resistance at B, right.
then it will have no effect on it.
The velocity.
Yeah, it's
Obviously, there's more to it than mass times velocity.
yeah, it's a bit. There's something more subtle that we're missing. I have to rethink it. 'Cause for some reason, I'm not clear on it right now. But let's come back to that. That's what he presents. Let's come back to it. We'll make it more clear maybe afterwards. So Leibniz says, well, let's look at what's it required to create a certain effect, and so measure the basis on what's required in terms of the work necessary in input to generate the effect you're getting. So if the work is consistent in putting into both objects, then the effect from both objects should also be the same. So he poses it in this way, to make it makes it seem like it's consistent. Alright, so let's take two objects. If I have a 4-pound object and a 1-pound object. He says, wouldn't it be the same if I take a 4-pound object and say I move that 1 foot, and I take 4 1-pound objects and move each of them 1 foot? Would that be the same amount of work?
No.
No? Why not?
Do you want to gravity?
Hmm?
Yeah, I mean,
The velocity
Time
changes.
difference.
Well, are you moving?
We're not
them?
regarding time.
Yeah. Are we moving them in steps? Are we dropping them? What's taking place?
You're taking 4 1-pound objects and lifting them up 1 foot. You're doing that 4 times. And again, a 4-pound object and moving that up once, 1 foot. Would that be the same amount of work? No?
I think it would be.
Why do you think it wouldn't be?
I think it would be less work to do the large object once, right? Because it's less like it seems like there's a lot of wasted motion, like just in the getting this, like the thing started and getting and stopping it.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you like if you turn on the lights, turn on and off, turn on and off, there's actually like powers wasted like in that transition.
Sure. But what about just lifting the object? Just that process of lifting.
I don't know. I don't know how you would test that.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it would depend on the
I
circumstance.
think there's just like I think people are like kind of mistaking the question. People think, well, if I pick up an object and like walk it across the room and put it down, if I do that 4 times, that's obviously going to be more work than doing it once to like one object. But I don't think that's the question necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. What do you guys? Ben?
I'm not 100% sure this applies, but if you are exercising, and you take a given exercise and you give the maximum weight you can do one exercise, and you cut that weight in half, you'll be able to do a lot more than twice.
Mm-hmm.
But that might be the same.
Okay.
Wouldn't it be exactly the same?
Yeah, that's what Leibniz is suggesting. You can take on these questions of time and these kinds of things, but generally he's just making. I think this is where the hang-ups come up in looking at the argument itself. He's just basically saying that it's the amount of what you're lifting. The work involved in lifting is lifting something up. If you're lifting that object, instead of just break this into 4 pieces. It's the same as lifting a 1-pound object 4 feet. It's the same relationships of work which you're accomplishing.
If you broke it down into many actions, in both cases you'd be carrying 1 pound, 1 foot 4 times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. It's funny, what you're probably involved in is you're kind of somehow maybe strategically trying to say, well, how would I tactically try to figure out how to make something most efficient? Like you somehow put a value on each of these. You said, well, I prefer to do a big amount of weight just once and get it over with. And so you go, that's obviously less work than this one. You're putting some kind of maybe psychological qualification on it. It is a choice in some ways. If we just look at the actual process, now Leibniz says, okay, from that standpoint, if those are the same amount of work, you get those to the same level. And if we take them on a pendulum, just your trusty swinging keys, they can probably do it.
I also
What's that?
I created several pendulums.
Yeah, sure. That.
And we attached up to them.
This is where the inefficiency of our laboratory comes in. We should actually build a good pendulum.
What if you're not strong enough to lift the heavy weight? Would it still be easier to lift the lighter weight really high? You can't lift the heavy weight at all.
Yeah, right. You put all kinds of qualifications on it, yeah. If you had a machine to do both, the amount of effort the machine would have to exert. Alright, so cool, an idea what a pendulum is. We'll just kind of demonstrate it here just to kind of see. This process is always kind of fun. You have to realize how many factors are really involved in setting up some kind of experiment just to create a simple pendulum. This is just not going to function as a pendulum, right? You've got all kinds of variables you're dealing with now, like my arm, my hand, my wrist. If we drop this,
you can stick it on the book up
turn that over. I think it's just gonna knock against this.
You really need to do that. Put it right at the edge,
You can try that. Yeah, there's all different things you can try. Can't see it. What's the? I guess I can pinch it here maybe, and pull it up. I don't know. We'll see. Huh. No, didn't see it. Hypothesis: how high will it go back up on the other side? You can see it better here. Right? At least it's closer. You're dropping it way up here, there's all kinds of different things you have to take into account. Different things are happening. Becomes more complicated. Yeah, it's spinning now. But you can see that there's some type of this is how I get people to like my classes. So you can see in some sense that it's somewhat gyrating. The amplitude is remaining the same. It diminishes each time a little bit. But each swing, the amplitude is nearly what it was the previous one. And it's diminishing largely because I can feel the string rubbing against my finger right now. So there's some level of friction taking place. These kinds of factors. Some level of air resistance. But to a certain sense, though, since the amplitude is almost the same each time, from one swing to the next, the amplitude, the height of the keys, from one swing to the next, is nearly the same. You could say where there was no friction on my finger, the height of the keys at some point on the swing, at the far end of one swing, has the ability, in falling, to again rise back up to the same height it was at the previous end of the swing. That's able to accomplish the same amount of work based on the amount of energy it kind of, say, kinetic energy. We'll say force in like quotes.
We're not allowed to use that word.
I know. That's been the bad word around here, I guess. We're also, it's intellectuals anymore. We can't use force. We're against tyranny. No force allowed. Just no brute force. All right. So that's Leibniz says that and this is something that's you have to go take yourself back to the 17th century a little bit, where this is becoming kind of a certain. The work in scientific areas is determine things like a clock, some sort of time measuring, a chronometer, to measure time, for things like sailing, for scientific experiments. So they're investigating the action of a pendulum. So that it's relatively familiar with certain people that this is the characteristic. If you take out certain physical factors, if we should build one, we greased it up real good and that kind of thing, we'll see how close it comes to approximating a similar amplitude. But this is the argument Leibniz is using. So if we swing a 1 pound object four feet high, when dropped along a pendulum, taking into account those perturbing factors, would rise on the other side of the swing to again 4 feet. That it would accomplish the same amount of work in the process of falling. That the mass, the weight of the object, we'll just say the force here at the bottom of the swing, has the ability to take that same object back up to 4 feet. It has the ability to accomplish that amount of work. If that's true, then that means that when this falls and this falls, they should have the same impact when falling. They both hurt as much. Who thinks that would be true?
Wait, why is that implied by the pendulum?
Yeah, right. Because if we say that we're looking for if the amount of work to create the conditions of effect, say you've got I mean, you can use kind of technology is not a bad example in a certain sense. Like just take a gun for example. So you've got a certain amount of maybe something more simple.
Like a bow and arrow.
Okay, sure, like a bow and arrow. That'll work well. Yeah, right. So you're looking at I think of two ways you can compare two things though. Yeah?
Imagine a baseball. You're lying on the ground, and the baseball is going to be set on top of your head.
Mm-hmm.
And we have like somebody who weighs about 100 pounds. If you've ever driven at 5 miles an hour and you manage a fifth of that, 100 pounds coming at 1 mile an hour, take that compared to throwing the baseball at your head at 100 miles an hour.
Okay.
That way you can account for the surface area and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. 1 mile impact of a 1 pound baseball, I guess it'd be denser than a regular baseball.
Mm-hmm.
Or a baseball and 100 pounds moving 1 mile an hour impact. You're going to feel it, but it's not going to really hurt.
Yeah.
Versus getting smacked in the head at 100 miles an hour, it's probably going to put you in the hospital.
Yeah, I'm not sure that answers your question though.
No, I'm just saying, why does the pendulum imply that?
Because it implies that the effect that the pendulum ball swinging down has is able to accomplish the same amount of work that was required for that pendulum to fall. No, that's just physically true. Right, what's physically true with the pendulum is that when it's swinging, the amount of energy it gains at the bottom of its swing is enough to accomplish the work to bring it back up to the same height it previously was at. So if this is 4 feet, a 1 pound object falling 4 feet on the pendulum has the ability to now, at the energy here, at the bottom of its swing, to bring that same 1 pound object 4 feet. Yeah.
So from the effect, you're saying the effect is like equal to the cause of we can know the cause by the effect.
Right. That the effect will never exceed the cause. Yeah, the effect will always represent the cause. Yeah, Leibniz has an explicit quote that says that. Yeah.
So if you had like a bag of sand, there's a hole in it, so the sand is falling out of the bag. So you start with like 4 pounds of sand at 1 foot. Say like you had it timed such that when it reaches the bottom, you have like 3 pounds of fall out of the bag.
There's only 1 pound left.
Yeah, but then go up very high.
I don't know if it's going to swing that slow.
Well, yeah, that would be, now you're taking into something a little bit different though. So now you're having a process of change which you'd have to incorporate. That would be taking place constantly through the entire process.
Is that what you're saying though, that like the point at the bottom, if it's the same amount of work to bring those 2 boxes to their heights?
Yeah, if the amount of work that can be accomplished at this point can take a 1 pound object 4 feet, the amount of energy gained from this 1 pound object falling 4 feet must be equivalent to that amount of work accomplished. So if it's the same amount of work to raise this 4 pound object 1 foot as it is to bring this 1 pound object 4 feet, and that's the same work in raising them that high, then based on this principle here, it must have the same effect when falling. Because when falling, it also has the same effect in accomplishing the work.
And how would we measure that impact?
Yeah.
By the destruction of the object, or by
yeah
balance?
Well, Leibniz references Galileo. And we can prove it that way. You want to see? Yeah? You guys want to go back to high school physics?
No.
Yeah.
I kind of liked high school physics.
My professor just really stung.
It's good. Much better than
It's not a bad
algebra
class.
and geometry.
Who thinks who thinks that it would be the same in falling? The same effect? Who thinks it would hurt as much? If a 4-pound object hit you from 1 foot and a 1-pound object from 4 feet?
Oh no.
Providing they're the same size as each other.
Who thinks that? Well, I know who thinks the Cartesians are right. That's a silly question. Okay. Let's just figure it out.
I mean, other than pain, is there an actual device you can construct to measure the force, the energy?
That's what we'll have to figure out.
Leonardo, he used wet clay,
Mm-hmm.
and he would measure the depth that the objects would sink into the clay as a metric.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty creative. Huh. We kind of need to see.
Some kind of scale there, like pounds of force. Would that not?
Yeah, that might work. I mean, it depends on what kind of scale you have. You don't want to break the scale when the first one drops. So. Yeah, I forgot the second one.
Yeah.
It's like a bet. See if it's harder. I'll hit first. So, yeah, we had to, this is some of the things that came up in doing the boxes. Obviously, this is obviously part of Lynn's paper. We asked for a refutation of Descartes' mechanics. We have to develop some technology to get at this question. It's not the easiest one to get at, but we can prove it from the standpoint of just like Newtonian physics. Yeah, you guys want to do that? Time is 10 o'clock. It's early, huh? Everyone's bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. Okay. So say we've got let's say we have a 4-pound object again. And who knows what the rate of acceleration near the Earth is in feet per second? Huh?
I think it's about 32 feet per second.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the rate of acceleration. Right, so just write it down. So that means that for every second falling, the object will increase in velocity to 32 feet per second. Does that make sense?
No matter how heavy?
For every second fall, no matter how heavy. Yeah, kind of weird, huh?
So you'll add 32 the next second?
So say that we let this 4-pound object fall 1 second. What's the velocity when it hits the ground? We hold it up. This is where it's kind of tricky because you're like it's totally post the process. You're not saying how far you dropped it, but you're saying if we drop it for 1 second. If it drops for 1 second. If it fell for 1 second, and for every second it increases its velocity by 32 feet per second. It starts out at 0 because you're dropping it, and it falls for 1 second, then it would be
32 feet.
Right.
Per second.
So how many feet did it fall? Huh?
1.
How many feet did it fall? Well, if it was traveling at a constant velocity at that point, then it would be 32 feet, right? But it hasn't. It was when we went from 0 to 32 feet per second over that time period.
Until 16.
Yeah. Wes remembers from his high school physics class.
No, I just took the average of it.
Yeah, right. Right, so it's going it starts out it's at 0, and it ends at 32 feet per second. And so the average velocity throughout the process would be 16 feet per second. Anybody think that's really funky?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Well, if we took it 1/4 of a second and 3/4 of a second, then right here would be 8 feet per second. Right here would be 24 feet per second.
Those would be thirds.
Halfway would be 16 feet per second. Yeah, I'm not really sure what the argument otherwise would be. But I have a good one. Why you can just take the average of something like this?
Otherwise, you have to like explain the whole motion.
Well, because you're trying to find the harmonic mean with another box.
It's because it's linear. So you take the average.
I mean, essentially, you're like trying to describe 1 second as an instant, so you'd have to take into consideration every moment of that second, or give an average, right? Now, if you're gonna snap, like say, how fast did it move over a period of time? 1 second.
You're looking for an average, right? You're saying, well, if it was always increasing, then what was the average velocity that it was traveling at if it's constantly increasing? It's kind of like the.
That's true. If you take if you take 16 feet per second is the halfway point of the drop, then you're going to take a symmetrical velocity either side of that midpoint, right? You can figure out that for each velocity higher than 16 feet, whichever one opposite of that below 16 feet, they're always going to have one that matches it. You know what I'm saying?
And the average between the two.
And the average between the two will always be 16. Like 24 plus 8
that's
is 32. 0 plus 32 is 32. You could take any of them. 26 plus 6, 27 plus 5, and so on. So you get a kind of a
right. No matter how many times how many pieces you divide that up into, take the sum of all those velocities and divide by that many pieces, you're always going to get 16.
That's Gauss's method for beating his elementary school teacher.
Right, he used the same idea.
The sum of all the numbers 1 to 100.
Right. Okay, so then if its average velocity is 16 feet per second and it fell 1 second, how many feet did it fall? 16 feet. So what's the quantity of motion? When this object hits the ground. Huh?
64.
64? Who said 64? You said 64? 16. Okay. What was the velocity when it hit the ground?
0.
Hey, yeah. Right before it hits the ground? Yeah, right. So if we say the impact when falling of this object is mass times velocity. Yeah. All right. That makes sense. Somebody want to do it? Okay. Well, what's the yeah? Okay. So let's take a 1 pound object and let it fall for 2 seconds. How fast is it gonna? What's the velocity gonna be for that object when it hits the ground? Yeah, right. Does that make sense? Anybody wonder why I do that?
What's the height?
We don't know. We'll have to figure that out. We know we've dropped it and it's fallen for 2 seconds before it hit the ground. Okay, so then, what is its average velocity?
32.
And how many feet did it fall?
64.
Does that make sense to people? Because you can't read it, or because it doesn't make sense?
Just because it doesn't.
Okay, let's figure it out. Okay, so what's that it hits the ground going 64 feet per second? Does that make sense?
Where did that come from?
It seems like we divided the first one in half.
For what part?
For how fast it was moving.
Just as far as well, I'm just asking what part you're referencing. Say, does it that it would hit the ground going 64 feet per second? Does that make sense to people? Why would it be going that fast when it hit the ground?
At that point.
Yeah. Because our rate of acceleration is 32 feet per second. Per second.
Okay. I don't like buses.
Oh, it's a 1.
Well, how many seconds did it fall?
2.
Right, so we went from 0, and then for every second falling, it was going to increase its velocity by 32 feet per second, and it fell for 2 seconds. So from 0, after 1 second falling, it'll be at 32 feet per second. In a second, it'll be at 64 feet per second.
Well, how far is it falling?
We have to figure that out.
Yeah, that's. But you put 64.
You put 64 already.
Oh well. Somebody. We already. We'll start. Okay.
That's why we're confused.
Yeah, it's just like.
Oh yeah. Oh, how do all those numbers get up there? Sure. Yeah. Okay.
64 feet.
So yeah, you guys are great. All right. So what would its average velocity be then?
Well, it's fallen 2 feet and at 1 foot. We established that it's 32 feet then per second. And half is 2 feet would be 32. Right?
Yeah, it's not going falling 2 feet, but yeah. So it's 32 feet per second.
Well, yeah, I guess. Yeah, that's 2 seconds.
And how far did it fall?
32, you get the answer.
Yeah, you do.
Can we do the different numbers?
Just redo it. Yeah, let's do it. We can do it again after we do this one.
Because we can say.
But do you know why it's 60? Do you know why it's 64? No. Okay, well then we'll just deal with this one. Just figure out why. Why might it be 64?
Wouldn't it have to be 32 feet?
What's that?
Wouldn't it be 32 feet, the height?
Why?
Well, if the speed is 64 feet per second,
Yeah.
that means it should have fallen that distance. It should have fallen 64 feet in only 1 second. But
That's the
but
velocity
it
it ends up at. Yeah, that's its ending velocity. It starts at 0.
Right. So, but it didn't go. But its entire velocity wasn't 64 feet
Mm-mm.
per second, and it took 2 seconds to cover that. So, wouldn't you say you would cut the total in half?
Well,
We took half of 64 feet per second to get the average velocity. Which is it went from 0 to 64, just like we did over here. We say we'll take the sum of any two that are opposite each other from the center. So we have 32 feet per second for its average velocity.
It seems kind of silly that it, if it's going 32 feet per second and it fell for 2 seconds, it seems kind of silly that we wouldn't understand that it was 60
I think it's silly.
feet per second.
You sit there, the people work it through.
I see why.
People see why the average velocity would be 32 feet per second? And if we divided this into feet parts, so you'd have 16 feet per second, 32 feet per second, 48 feet per second, and then 64 feet per second. If we took the sum of 0 and 64 and 16 and 48 and divided that by 4,
And you can also say that that's the arithmetic mean, right?
Yeah, right.
I still can't see like how it would fall 64 feet in 2 seconds.
But it hasn't fallen. You don't know how that it's fallen. Okay, that's okay. If you don't see that, that's fine. If that is indeed the case, let's figure out what do you think it would be?
Oh, I see.
Well, did you figure out? We figured out why this was 16 feet, right?
Yeah.
You remember why?
It was the average of the velocity.
Yeah, it was average velocity was 16 feet per second. But do you know why it fell 16 feet?
1 second.
Huh?
That's right.
I don't know why.
Shouldn't it be 30 feet?
Well, if you say you have a velocity, say you're going 60 miles an hour and you travel for an hour, how far have you gone?
60 miles.
Pretty easy, right? Okay, so now you're going 16 feet per second, you travel a second. How far have you gone?
8 feet. Oh, we're not going 60 feet.
You're not?
On an average.
If you're going somewhere between 2 points and you started the journey fast and then slowed down at the end, like say you're going 50 mile an hour and then 20 mile an hour, and then instead you found something like a number in between that and went that the whole say whatever's between that 35 mile an hour, and you went that the whole way, you'd still get there in the same amount of time, won't you?
Yeah.
Sort of same thing is at work when you're getting average speeds.
So this makes.
Why don't you, Mike? Why don't you do one with where it's 3 seconds and see what maybe that would help.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's just see if we can just finish this, and then we can play with it a lot more. So we just add more, it'll just be.
Well, that makes sense.
So if we go from 0 to 64 feet per second, the average velocity was 32 feet per second. Does that make sense? Torrance figured out what it was divided by 4. If we took 0, 16, 48, and 64.
But not 32.
Well, if you took 32, you'd have to take it twice. Or you can take 32 and divide by 5. Yeah, that'll work. Try that.
So I'm going to take 1, 2, 3. I'm going to take this 4.
0, 16, 32, 48, 64, and divide by 5.
So you take 32 twice.
No, if you take 32 twice, divide it by 6.
What would you call that 64 at the bottom? What would be your name for that?
I think I heard it's called terminal velocity. I don't know.
Oh, okay. Because one of the things that they always would emphasize is the difference between speed and acceleration.
Right. Yeah, this is the acceleration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're not the same thing. Speed and acceleration are not the same thing.
Yeah. Even then, they're still elusive terms, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I get what Glenn said helped me figure it out. Is that if you imagine two bodies at the same point, and one just takes off at 32, which would be its average speed over the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to pass up. It's going to pass the first one up in the beginning, and they're going to meet each other, right? In the somewhat probably, I guess, at the third quarter of it.
Mm-hmm.
Or no, I guess they meet each other at the very end. Maybe the general. That'd be right. What he said.
Oh, these two objects?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me.
One started off at 32.
Uh-huh.
From the very get-go.
Mm-hmm.
They would meet at the end at the same time, right? If one did 32 the whole time.
Not in that case. Dealing with gravity.
I was just saying, if you had two objects that moved at
Oh, I see.
If one moved at 32 the entire time,
Uh-huh.
and the other one moved according to this principle of acceleration, they would still meet at the same point, right?
I'm not exactly sure.
Each one with the first one at the second one.
Because that's the idea of the average, right?
If one went at 16, you mean, right? If one took off at 16 and the other one sped up from 0 to 32?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you're talking about the first.
Oh,
one,
yeah.
No,
Yeah, sure.
If the moment it moved, it was going at 32, which would be the same as the average of this one.
Oh, the second one you're saying?
Yeah, the second one.
Yeah. Right, now it went from 0 and ended up at 64.
Yeah, they would get there at the same point.
Right, yeah.
That's the same thing as. So the first one, which is easier to look at because it's moving at a constant rate, you would say each second it was moving, it would cover 32 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it moved for 2 seconds, it would cover 64 feet.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that's where I think it's not like it's not just a fun thing to find the average. Like it's really necessary to.
Yeah, in this case,
it's pretty
yeah.
necessary to measure.
Sure, in this case, yeah. If you're looking at some of these empirical, you want to figure out some empirical measurements, yeah.
Who else? Just pull it up.
All right, so people see then, if we're traveling 32 feet per second, if this body's falling, has an average velocity of 32 feet per second, and falls for 2 seconds, how much distance would it travel? SAT question number 4. You have A. But what you'll find, though, is when you begin to deal with actual machine tooling process, all the principles that we work on, you have to understand them, but when you're applying them, you're applying constant approximations. You're doing types of things like averages of distances. Like you're applying an actual physical process, you do need to know some of the technical aspects. That's why engineering today has a problem, because all they show them is that. They don't get the principles behind what they're applying. So this would be 64 feet. Something travels for 32 feet per second, and it goes for 2 seconds. You get a sum of 64 feet.
That's fine.
Yeah, I know. People remember why we're doing this?
So you say that change in velocity is linear, and so that's why the approximation works. Why you can.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah.
So we're looking at quantity of motion.
Yeah, we're looking at the quantity of motion to see. Well, let's look at something now. We've got 16 feet, a 4-pound object that's fallen 16 feet, and a 1-pound object fallen 64 feet.
Okay.
So they should have the same. They should have the same quantity of motion. They should have the same effect. People see that? That this one here is 4 times higher. And this is 4 times heavier. People see that?
Yes.
So what's the quantity of motion for this object here?
Mass times velocity.
And which would be what for this one?
1 times, so it's 32.
When it hits?
64.
All right. So this one should hurt more if mass times velocity is correct.
Heavy one. Lower.
So now we've got a problem.
This doesn't tell us anything about like the actual like curve, like whether or not this rate of change is like curved or like diagonal or anything like that, right? Because like, I mean, just because the acceleration like is 32 feet per second, you don't know at what rate it's getting to 32 feet per second. Like, you don't know if it's like...
Yeah, it's 32 feet per second per second.
Like that, or if it's like...
Oh, right.
You know what I mean, if you graphed it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or do you? I don't know.
Well, the rate of acceleration is changing depending on how far you are from the planet, from the surface of the Earth. So you have to take into account some of those changes.
Oh, really? Okay, so this is just when you're really close to the surface. Well, go ahead.
It's okay. People think this is right. Is this an accurate account for the effect that these objects are having? It's going to make it just work for every little piece right now. If I just say it, it's just going to be nothing.
Say it again?
Are these two objects? Should this be the accurate measurement of their effects? Should this object have twice the effect that this one has? Why not, Jeremy?
It's contrary to experience.
Okay, you've been hit a lot. Why? No. Why? Why does it not make sense?
He was hit by Quincy.
I mean, I could think of a number of examples.
Can you see why from just the physics of it? Why this? From what we did over here? Do you think this holds true? The amount of work that it takes to get a 4-pound object 1 foot is equivalent to getting a 1-pound object 4 times the height. If you carried a 5-gallon jug of water from Chi here, would that be equivalent to carrying a 5 1-gallon bottles from Chi here?
No.
It wouldn't be the same of lift? So like on your back?
Well,
and some?
Yeah.
That's a good way to think about it. You carried them all at once. Maybe they're all strung together over your back. Maybe you carried 1 5-gallon one at once.
Hmm? That's one way of thinking of it. So then if the amount of work to raise these each up is the same, when each of these fall, we have a 1-pound object falling 4 feet. And a 4-pound object going 1 foot. That this pendulum, this body, when it's falling 1 foot, is able to accomplish the same amount of work as it took to raise this one up 1 foot. So when falling, it's able to accomplish has the potential to accomplish the same amount of work as this one here. Does that make sense? So that means that when these two objects are falling, since it takes the same amount of work to raise them up, they should have the same effect when falling. The cause was the same.
But you're taking it to velocity.
Hmm?
You might have to change what we're calling work. Because I think for the only difference with the Chi water thing, it would make sense that the same amount of work got done, but it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be the same amount of effort, right? Because that's why we can't unload the pamphlets from the car. They're like one big.
Yeah, sure.
Leave, you get to do like the toss. So I want to distinguish between like the work and the effort, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. We're going to run into funny technical problems with the words.
How
Yeah.
we just prove that it takes more energy to lift the heavier object? To lift the heavier object a fourth of the distance than object that weighs 1/4, but the other object weighs 4 times, moving the smaller object 4 times. So, my question: have we just proved that it's harder to move the 4-pound object 1 foot? It's harder to move that 4-pound object 1 foot than to move the 1-pound object 4 feet. So can we just prove that with the...
No, what we've said so far is that instead of using work, because you just get... We're just running into complications with the terminology. Say we use effort. The amount of effort it takes to raise a 4-pound object 1 foot is the same amount of effort required to raise a 1-pound object 4 feet.
I would agree with that, but the multiplication came out different.
Right, but this is the quantity of motion. This is what Descartes was suggesting.
Actually, you just kind of double it on that side, though. It would still be the same. Because you only did it twice as much.
Did what twice as much?
The mass times velocity
Yeah.
was actually 4 times the, if it was, 4 seconds.
Well, I took a 1-pound object and multiplied it by its velocity of 64 feet per second. I took a 4-pound object and multiplied it by 16 feet per second, or 32 feet per second.
Oh, okay. So 16 is, 1/4 the distance of 60. I get it.
So something breaks down. Right.
So either your measurement is wrong
Since I have that effect on the ladies.
Let's see what Leibniz has to say.
On the Nature of Body and the Laws of Motion, 1690, Leibniz. There was a time when I believed that all the phenomena of motion could be explained on purely geometric principles, assuming no metaphysical propositions, and that the laws of impact depend only on the composition of motions. But through more profound meditation, I discovered that this is impossible, and I learned a truth higher than all mechanics, namely that everything in nature can indeed be explained mechanically, but that the principles of mechanics themselves depend on metaphysical and, in a sense, moral principles, that is, on the contemplation of the most perfect, efficient, and final cause, namely God, and cannot in any way be deduced from the blind composition of motions.
This is the following section of the Discourse on Metaphysics. Whoa.
Sarah.
Chase, you want to read?
The distinctions between force and quantity of motion is important, among other reasons, for judging that one must have recourse to metaphysical considerations distinct from extension in order to explain the phenomena of bodies. This consideration, the distinction between force and quantity of motion, is rather important, not only in physics and mechanics, in order to find the true laws of nature and rules of motion, and even to correct the several errors of practices which have slipped into writings of some able mathematicians, but also in metaphysics, in order to understand the principles better. For if we consider only what motion contains precisely and formally, that is, change of place, motion is not something entirely real. And when several bodies change position among themselves, it is not possible to determine, merely from a consideration of these changes, to which body we should attribute motion or rest, as I could show geometrically if I wished to stop and do this now. But the force or proximate cause of the changes is something more real, and there is sufficient basis to attribute it to one body more than to another. Also, it is only in this way that we can know to which body the motion belongs. Now, this force is something different from size, shape, and motion, and one can therefore judge that not everything conceived in body consists solely in extension and in its modifications, as our moderns have persuaded themselves. Thus we are once again obliged to reestablish some beings or forms they have banished. And it becomes more and more apparent that, although the particular phenomena of nature can be explained mathematically or mechanically by those who understand them, nevertheless the general principles of corporeal nature and of mechanics itself are more metaphysical than geometrical, and belong to some indivisible forms or natures as the causes of appearances, rather than corporeal mass or extension. This is the reflection capable of reconciling the mechanical philosophy of the moderns with the caution of some intelligent and well-intentioned persons who fear, with some reason, that we are withdrawing too far from immaterial beings, to the disadvantage of piety.
So what's metaphysical about this? That's what he just said, right? That's the implication he made. So there's a metaphysical cause, not merely a mechanical one, not one that can be known to your senses. Well, Leibniz value, what they give now for kinetic energy, is mass times velocity squared.
So metaphysical about that?
Yeah, what do you think?
Take a stab at it. I was seeing a problem with this whole thing. I think partly because I didn't understand it. But besides the fact of just looking at this object and then hitting the floor, I know Bruce brought this a lot, but also questioning the circumstances that it has given it the ability to move that rate of change, or what's creating the potentiality, which it will speed up in that rate of change. So it's a more broader question. I think it leads towards that. I mean, I don't know to pinpoint it exactly, but it's towards something like that. That's just the problem with the discussion I was having earlier. But I'm pretty sure it wasn't Leibniz.
Yeah?
So is Leibniz just basically saying that there's more factors than mass times velocity that should go into? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, well, yeah, he says the value is mass times velocity. Somebody can try to see if that's right. Does mass times velocity squared work?
No, but I mean, is what Leibniz proposing is that there's way more factors than just simply the mass of an object.
He's saying that mass times velocity squared implies that it's not just equal proportions of mass and velocity. Like if I if I double the mass or double the velocity, the effect will be the same. He's saying that motion itself has greater significance in the process. Something about generating some type of physical change. that motion itself is really just something which isn't in and of itself substantial. Velocity itself isn't something which is substantial. It's a shadow of something larger. Because the effect that object has moving isn't just based on that velocity. The effect that object has is based on the cause which generated that velocity.
So is he saying that the problem with Descartes' method is that it doesn't include anything which is universal, like anything which is like a universal cause for these changes, rather than because it seems like this system here, this mechanistic system, is very relative to the circumstances of Earth and objects on Earth and their relationship, but it doesn't seem like it would apply very well to planetary bodies or something like that.
This Leibniz applies to this. And that one thing about a principle is that it's going to manifest itself differently in different ways.
In different circumstances?
Right, like a different gravitational field will obviously have a different rate of acceleration and these kinds of considerations. But Leibniz is getting at something. I mean, Leibniz applies to this. It has to if it's going to be universal. But the question is that Leibniz is getting at something more fundamental to the relationship of the human species to the physical universe. He's getting at the substance of what Descartes only presented the form. Yeah, there's something about human thought or the human consciousness towards one's identity. But it's not merely that. Because Descartes stumbles upon that conception from doubt. Let me doubt the nature of everything. And the first thing I can posit, I can affirm, is that I'm able to doubt. I'm able to question. But that doesn't provide substance to maintain the quality of your existence. What's generating the characteristic of human existence is something different. And that's the form by which that Leibniz then has to. You have to somehow bring that up. What's not seen. You definitely don't see velocity squared anywhere. You never see that. That's one aspect of it that's just not. You'd never just go, why it's the velocity squared.
No, one thing I've been a little bit confused about is where's that mass times velocity squared coming from? Is that a Leibniz thing or a Descartes?
That's Leibniz. That's Leibniz. It'll work. Try it. That's what they call kinetic. They call I think one half of this they call it kinetic energy today.
How do you know it was squared?
How do you know it was squared? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe just it's empirical. But there might be something that has a greater significance to identify that it's the process of motion itself.
Had Leibniz discovered the calculus already? He was investigating this.
I don't know the exact date of his discovery of the calculus, or to what extent. He's obviously dealing with the same concept. The dialogue of motion, I think, takes place before this.
Hey, could you elaborate more on what you said about the velocity isn't that important, but it's what causes the velocity?
Yeah, that's what this is. That's what this is getting at in a certain sense. If you just take the velocity of the object, the object hitting the ground, then you get Descartes' quantity of motion. You say, okay, this is how we're going to measure the effect of these objects based on its velocity and its weight. But we know that the effect of these two objects is the same. We already know that. Because the cause of these objects was equivalent. The cause of raising a 4-pound object 16 feet is the same amount of cause, or equivalent in effort required, to raise a 1-pound object 64 feet. So it's what's the actual. So the effect's going to be. Leibniz is saying that the effect's going to be the same as the cause. You're not going to have a greater effect than the cause. That you're going to have a certain. There's a kind of that the effect will be equal. From that standpoint, these two objects have to have an equal relationship, an equal effect.
So you're saying they have an equal effect?
Yeah, they do.
So what's the mv squared? That's not.
That'll give you the number of. That'll give you Leibniz's version of force. What they would call now kinetic energy.
So then the effect is independent of the force.
No,
they have a different force, amount of force, but they have the same effect.
Oh, they have this. Well, no, that's just because we're getting into the language. It becomes difficult because we're dealing with a little bit kind of pre-modern language. All these things get redefined more specifically later. But we'll say the force and effect we'll say is equivalent. We'll say the quantity of motion is Descartes' measurement for force. He said it's mass times velocity. Leibniz says it's mass times velocity squared.
What's the half next to it?
That's supposedly what they give for kinetic energy today.
No, okay, so let me see. You're saying that Descartes looked at both of these and saw that they were different because he was only measuring the quantity of motion, which is m times v, and so therefore the one with the 4 weight going for 1 second was 128, which was double that of the second diagram.
Right.
Now, if you were to square both of those, it would still, 128 squared is still a lot
mass
more
times
than
velocity
64
squared. So you have 64 squared, I think is 4,096, and 32 squared. I think it's 1,024. And then times 4 will be 4,096.
Does that mean that the other one would be the same?
What is the velocity? The velocity we're squaring would be the velocity that they end up with. 32 feet per second and 64 feet per second.
Hey, Mom.
Well, can you show those numbers work out? Because I want to see how that formula works out.
64 squared is 4096.
32 squared.
Hey, Mike, what is the same thing? I got here kind of late.
Yeah, I'm struggling to see the equality. I mean, I kind of know what you're saying conceptually, but just in terms of the formula.
So that's the force it exerts?
That's the mass times velocity squared, yeah. You just get fun. It's the force. Maybe with you.
Well, he called it living force.
Yeah.
Okay.
Vis viva.
All right. Now I get it.
Right. Vis viva.
What was the Deus ex machina?
Deus machina?
Yeah.
Deus ex machina. How do you ever say it? Latin?
Yeah.
God is the machine. That's just referencing Descartes' duality. I don't know a lot of the specifics of it.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Start looking at the equations.
Uh-huh.
What comes to my mind, or probably to a lot of people, is the relativity equations. And do you see any thoughts on that? You see the mass times the speed of light squared.
Well, all the philosophical basis for relativity are models. We reread the section 18 again. The first thing he references is relativity of motion. The whole special theory of relativity is basically what Leibniz references in the first part of section 18. From a philosophical basis, it's equivalent. It's the same thing.
Precise,
Yeah. So it's being there, but I would say getting into subatomic physics. Yeah.
Now, what bearing does the squaring the mass time velocity have, other than mathematically come out to an equal?
Glad you asked.
Proportion.
I also have like a demonstration, an analogy for it with light.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's a really short experiment.
Go ahead.
Specium dynamicum. These considerations are not worthless, nor are they merely verbal, for they have important applications in the comparison of machines and motion. For if enough force is received from water power, animals, or some other cause like steam, to keep a heavy body of 100 pounds in constant motion, so that it can complete a horizontal circle 30 feet in diameter in a fourth of a minute, and someone claims that a weight twice as large put in its place would complete half the circle in the same time, and with less expenditure of power, and claims this means a profit to you, you may know that you are being deceived and are losing half of your force.
Is that like steam? Did you put that in there?
Yeah, that's it. Merv did it originally. He just put steam, and I just put like steam because it's like made it more. Yeah.
The exclamation point gives it away.
Yeah. The like steam. Yeah.
Like steam.
It's like the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer when you're like Pinocchio. Yeah.
Like steam.
So obviously Leibniz is considering this in terms of physical processes. I mean, he's thinking of the science from the standpoint of human discovery of these types of underlying causes. Not merely because that's what can be observed, because that's what's necessary to enhance human activity. I know that when Lynn references dynamics, he's not merely referencing, a non-percussive science. Right? It's not merely that there's an underlying condition. I mean, even Bertrand Russell will admit that Euclid's assuming a certain characteristic of space. That doesn't mean that Bertrand Russell gets dynamics, because he recognizes that Euclid's assuming flatness of space without addressing flatness directly. The dynamics is that you're actually discovering principles which enhance human activity to improve the human condition. You're not passively observing. You're not merely a spectator. You're taking responsibility. I think there's just one more.
I have discovered that the power of bodies does not consist in quantity of motion, that is, in the product of weight times velocity, as in commonly believed, and that in transferring power from body to body, the same quantity of motion is not conserved, as the Cartesians are greatly persuaded. Furthermore, I have discovered that this law of nature holds instead, namely, that the whole effect has the same power as its full cause. When I discovered these things, I judged that it was worth the trouble to muster the force of my reasonings through demonstrations of the great evidence, so that little by little I might lay the foundations for the true elements of a new science of power and action, which one might call dynamics.
Can you just explain the one before this one?
Yeah, that circle thing.
Yeah, sure. This is coming. There's two parts to the Specium Dynamicum. The first one was published in his lifetime. The second wasn't. And it was written largely on request of most of his associates because he was developing a new approach to physical science, a new method of developing experimental processes. And so he's obviously involved in things like mining. He's the mining minister for the area, Brunswick or Hanover. I don't know if do you have a specific question as far as just why the horizontal circle? That's my question too.
No, so it's going half the distance.
Okay.
Is going half the distance.
He says in fourth of a minute.
Expenditure of power.
Yeah. So it's going. So it says someone that claims that a weight twice as large, put in its place, would complete half the circle in the same time. So it's going half as slow, but twice as heavy.
Yeah.
That would be BS.
But that would give you more force. That would give you more effect.
And Leibniz is saying that it should be the same effect?
No, he's saying you'd be a dupe to accept someone who would give you such an offer.
Yeah, but the offer is that you would get more effect, and what Leibniz seems to be saying is that it would be the same effect. Right?
He's saying it would be less.
It would be less.
He says that's why he says, you may know that you are being deceived and are losing half of the force.
Oh, right.
Why is that?
We should be able to.
Because it's a. We could do the math, I guess, in a certain sense. It's the same thing we did. So let's see. I go in 1 minute. It's going to do 4 laps around the circle. So it's going to be 8 pi. It's going to be 8 pi per second velocity. So 100 pounds at 8 pi per second, or 200 pounds at 4 pi per second. So you have 100 times 64 pi squared, or you'd have 200 times 16 pi squared. You basically end up with half the force with the one that had a 200-pound weight. Going half as fast, but twice as heavy.
Right. So the other one's half as weighty, but twice as fast. So since the fast part's what's getting squared.
Right, it's the velocity which is getting squared. It's not just a one-to-one relationship like you have with the lever. If you change the distance and the weight, you could be the reciprocal of each other. If you do half of one, you double the other. And the motion itself has a greater impact on the physical process. And that's where the whole collision of balls comes in, but it's a more subtle argument that I haven't gotten my hands on really yet.
Yeah, that sounds. I mean, that makes sense there, but I guess I'm just still confused on the thing you had previous.
Previous to this?
Oh yeah, on there you had the mass times velocity squared between the 4 and the 1 pound.
Yeah.
And they both had the same force.
Yeah.
And I see how that worked out, but I don't know, I'm just confusing what all these other arguments that have been sort of thrown out. Like the idea that you'd rather have, you're saying they'd rather have something 1 pound or something 100 pounds traveling 1 mile an hour hit them than something 1 pound traveling 100 miles an hour hit them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I was getting confused just between velocity and distance.
I just mean that.
Yeah, sure.
It's just that specific example, I think.
Yeah.
For this specific example, the mass happens to balance out the square of the velocity.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I got confused in that. So just in that one example,
which one?
The 4 balances out the b squared, because the b squared is 2.
Yeah. Right.
2 squared.
Right.
But if you took the one you just mentioned, it wouldn't be anywhere close. 100 squared.
Yeah, hey, that's where I was getting confused. It's just in that example, it does.
I do have like an analogy for understanding squared relationships, because light operates on a squared relationship. So, for instance, is there any way to shut that? Make it dark.
Sure.
Like if you take a light in a certain distance. Right. So if I'm going to shine this.
You want this on?
Yeah. So if I shine this light, right, I'm at a certain distance. I'm gonna go halfway. I'm gonna go halfway over. So how bright do you think it's gonna get?
Really bright. Or brighter.
So everyone can see how bright it is? Okay, I'm gonna go halfway forward. How bright? Is it gonna be twice as bright?
Twice as bright.
Probably more bright.
Square bright.
Twice as bright or more bright?
Twice as bright.
Same.
All right.
Same.
Walk forward with it.
Can you go half that distance?
Okay, so now I'm gonna go half that distance. Is it gonna be twice as bright?
Yeah, it seems pretty bright.
It's
No,
brighter.
it seems like it's more than.
Go halfway.
It's
Way
squared.
That's
exponential.
I guess that's
Yeah.
not good.
Right on.
So it's like you're going half the distance, but it's 4 times as bright. And so it's like, what would you rather have, like, to read with? Would you like a really, really strong wattage, light over there to fill up the whole room, or would you just need a little light to focus on the page? Sometimes.
Is that a question of the velocity, though?
Well, I'm just saying light operates on surface area and distance and brightness. It's a squared relationship. I was just demonstrating an analogy of a squared relationship because it's kind of hard to imagine squared velocity, but you can imagine brightness. And
I have a difficulty with that either. Brightness twice as bright. I don't know how to measure that.
I think that the squared velocity should be bothersome. It's much like the bothersome of differential calculus or anything that's. You're seeing a process of, because everything you see, we're assuming that what's real about an object moving is that how much weight that object has and how fast it's moving. That seems to be that's what's most knowable about that object. Yet that's not what has the physical significance of the object.
I mean, velocity itself is a concept, and it's a derivative of something that's measurable. Distance, for example, and the weight.
Well, it's an imposed scale, right? Yeah. Quantized.
Velocity is something that's derived from these, something that's measurable. But it exists only as a concept. It doesn't exist. And that's I see that part. I mean, that way it's bothering us, and especially square that concept.
Yeah. Well, he's looking at more of. That's where do some more work. We can bring the argument back to really investigate this quantity of this question of motion, the question of inertia. Because that's the subtleness of Leibniz's arguments that come up in his writings. Is the question of a tendency of an object to stay in motion or to stay at rest, but not to accelerate. And you're looking at the accelerated force. force which can accelerate something. And the effect of that is then determined through a kinetic energy, through mass times velocity. What's up, Code? You got a question?
Yeah, I have another question. All right, so you read this quote from Leibniz saying that the effect cannot be greater than the cause.
Yeah.
Now, what we had measured as the mv squared of the force, is that the effect?
Yeah.
Okay. And the cause is what was required to elevate either one of those up to their position.
Right. Something similar to the bullet seems to be pretty decent. Obviously, you get things like nuclear power or the steam engine, these kinds of
So
things.
since they both had the same, in this case, they both had the same effect, we can know that the same amount of cause was required to.
Yeah, well, we knew in a certain sense. Yeah, in a certain sense, we knew that Descartes was wrong initially because we knew they had we knew they had the same cause. And yet, the way Descartes was measuring effect was.
How did we know they had the same cause?
Well, that was where the idea. That's what Leibniz presents initially. Is that you have these two objects, one's 4 times heavier than the other.
Yeah.
And you raise the lighter one 4 times higher than the first. That's going to have the same amount of work, or the same amount of effort. It's kind of just like the lever.
Yeah.
The distance and weight relationship. If 3 pounds 10 feet away is equal to 10 pounds 3 feet away, on the lever they stay balanced. They're both accomplishing the same amount of effort. They're both applying the same amount of weight or force on the lever. So that's true in the pendulum swinging. When an object falls, so the 1 pound object falls 4 feet in kind of in a vacuum without friction or something, that pendulum ball will rise back up to 4 feet.
Yeah.
So that what it's accomplishing in falling, what's necessary to accomplish that amount has the necessary effort to bring it back up to 4 feet.
For the isolate and quantify the cause seems like a much harder.
So that's a way. So what the pendulum is showing then is, it's a way of proving exactly the amount of effort which is required to have that thing move minimally, right?
It shows that the falling and lifting is the same.
Because otherwise, you could have like Leibniz's like disk machine thing, where it would actually, if you have like a steam engine or something that's running this disk around in a circle, like potentially the same exact machine could move 100 pounds, or it could move 1,000 pounds with the same amount of effort if that's built into the machine, right? Like, if the machine is capable of pushing something 1,000 pounds, and you put something that's 100 pounds on it, you're not going to have to add more power to the steam engine to move the larger object. It's going to be because the machine operates a certain way. But like what the pendulum seems to show to me is that the amount of energy needed to lift that weight is the same as the falling, like the pull of gravity. So I think that's why that seems to be why it's useful, at least to me. I mean, maybe I'm missing the point, but
yeah, well, that what you're getting from the steam engine, that it might be more complicated than what we're dealing with, but the circular action, you're dealing with something different. In the way with the gears and things, but with the pendulum, I think what you're saying is right. Yeah. Okay. It was needed to lift it is the same as what's gained in falling.
So if you were going to fight 4 100-pound guys in a cage match, or 1 400-pound guy in a cage match, it would be harder.
Yeah, that's why we avoid force.
The bigger they are, the harder they fall.
So you said that Descartes got mass times velocity from Archimedes taking a balance and looking.
Same method.
But so he was taking something from statics and applying it to motion.
Yeah.
And so, but then Leibniz looks at what's happening with the pendulum with motion,
Let's look at cause. This is where the question of form and substance. The form Descartes' taking is right, that there is a way of mathematically describing these physical phenomena. These mechanical events, these processes of motion, can be described with certain mathematical relationships, which isn't obvious, which isn't self-evident. You wouldn't know a priori without some kind of physical investigation that you could use mass and velocity or mass and distance at all to determine these types of physical events. But the substance of Descartes is looking at, he's merely looking at ephemeral phenomena. You couldn't put your hand on velocity. And
That's what I was asking. Is that then with like I guess squaring, is there motion implied?
Well,
squaring the velocity isn't.
That just happens to arise out of the process. But what Leibniz is looking for is that the measurement has to include what's able to generate the process. The potential for action is what we're looking to measure, not the effect per se that we can perceive.
Well, I guess my question is, what relationship does that have to when you geometrically square a line?
Yeah, this is where. Well, the question is like, yeah, they're just different applications of a similar principle. In one, you're applying it to just geometric reasoning. The other one, you're applying it to physical phenomena. If you're asking the question is why is the force or the energy of an object mass times velocity squared? Yeah, I couldn't tell you why that's the case, except for the fact that that's the subtle argument Leibniz. That's where I'm not.
I mean, if he was concerned about, if he was just focused on form, he could just square the mass, and you still get the same.
But it probably wouldn't account. Well, if we do that in this case, it would fail, because our 1 pound object squared. But see, the problem is though that we do have another addendum to the class. Now we could show how weight and velocity and acceleration all are really indefinable. Because you're the problem, like you square the mass. Okay, but exactly what quantity are you squaring? The weight, the density, the number of particles.
But the velocity is the actual change?
No, velocity is what? It's some kind of distance covered. What's your distance?
Right.
An inch, a centimeter, a millimeter.
So I don't know. I guess I'm having a hard time understanding why the velocity is valid in Leibniz's argument, but it's not valid in Descartes.
But in Leibniz, it's not the substance of his argument. In Descartes, it is the substance. Descartes saying what I perceive to be the qualities of this phenomena are velocity and mass. What Leibniz is saying, what I find to be the substance of this phenomena is the cause which is capable of generating the action itself. Not merely the perception of the action. Not that which I can perceive of the action.
And the cause is the dynamis, or?
Yeah, and the ability to actually discover the principles which are involved and apply them. It's an application.
And so that is observable through his experiments with the pendulum and with the
that's his
the
that's a method of argument. That's what he's using for
yeah. And Descartes is using the lever, right?
No, it's not. I mean, it's a way of getting a sense of how he's approaching it. I don't know exactly what. I don't think Descartes uses. I don't think Descartes.
Well, right, Descartes. I mean, I
don't think Descartes even wrote it. I mean, Descartes probably
retarded.
someone told him to write it if he ever wrote that. So
right.
it's.
No, I definitely understand that there's a difference in the approach.
What Leibniz finds out is that mass times velocity squared is what able to incorporate when you have different causes of events, that mass times velocity squared incorporates similar causes for different weights of objects. What he's measuring then is cause. potential of events. And there's obviously a more subtle argument around the question of motion.
Mark, how are you planning to end this class?
What time or how?
No, how?
Oh. There's a thing that Merv put at the end of the box, yeah. So now, if this is a 1 pound object, oh whoops, oh it's not up there. It's to be considerate. She's old. Now this is a 1 pound object. Yeah, the force of my computer pales compared to modern ones.
Oh, so the top half of the string is fast.
So if this is 4 feet, and this 1 pound object, the kinetic energy of this pendulum at the bottom of its swing is the same of any just normal pendulum, any circular pendulum. But now this is a cycloidal. So now you think that in physical phenomena, the measurement of cause is equivalent. But in application to, say, human processes, this has an even greater impact. So you really begin to get a question of what dynamics is. Determining ideas.
Hey Mike, is this how it looks if you're moving near the speed of light?
If it is, it'd be really cool. That's really slow. It wasn't that slow before.
It's because you got so many windows open.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Gives you time to forecast.
Yeah.
Wait, so this is supposed to be following along?
This is more pedagogical, don't you think? Isn't this much more helpful to see what's happening?
This is following along the path of a Christopher.
Yeah, this is the cycloidal, so it's been kind of pinched so that the tangents of the pendulum are determining the brachistochrone for a swing. And so the periodicity of each swing would be the same.
I don't really understand what that just meant, but I just know that what is that? What does this have to do in the arguments before with, say, a ball put at a lower point along the pathway, getting to the middle of the swing?
The way this works is you know what a brachistochrone is? That's what you'd called it.
I mean, I've seen the equal time.
This is there we go, look at that.
Yeah, way to render.
This is more the speed of light, and it was more accurate. I'll slow down. So this is if you rolled a circle on this line, you get this curve. You cut this curve in half, and I guess you put this end. You just move this part here diagonally over. And the way this string would, when it swings, becomes kind of pinched along this, and the tangents of the swinging ball, the string, end up creating a function which causes the ball to take this curve versus just a normal circle. That's what's happening, right? Just generally a description. I'm not sure that's even clear. The nature of the curve, we have one up there, is that when a ball falls down it, though when it rolls down here, if it rolls, it won't reach to the top. The time it takes for it to travel from here to here will be the same it takes to travel from here to here. The period is the same. Though the amplitude is constantly diminishing, the period at which it takes to travel will always be the same. And that's to do to a function of the cosine. Let's see an accurate measurement of time now. It's quantized time. It's a measurable amount. So the implications, the comment made at the end of the box then is that a normal pendulum will have the same force at the bottom here. If this is a 1 pound object falling 4 feet, the velocity will be the same in each case. It doesn't matter that it's cycloidal or circular. But the cycloidal aspect of it, that it maintains the same periodicity, does have an impact for human society. Obviously the advancements in science are capable. You have accelerated advancement in scientific ability because now you have a measurable time. The ability to increase the density of discoveries has now changed because of the consideration of now a measurable, quantized notion of time. So but that's not measured in the force at the bottom of the swing. The force at the bottom of the swing is the same in each pendulum, whether it be a normal circular pendulum or this one. Okay. That's what's determining that force, which is now different. But you don't even see that in the force itself. Much like the velocity squared. It's not too much of a stretch, just late. Yeah, you use that. Sheet, I don't know, I think it was next to doing a demonstration with the cheese. Energy flux density or something?
No, that's just to be consumed by everybody.
Oh, good.
That's to see how good
That's
fungus
especially
is.
for the people who stayed in here.
Right. The good cheese.
Where's the guacamole, Nick?
It's all gone.
It's all gone.
Yeah, but please help yourself.
What kind is it?
I don't know.
Parmesan or something?
It's pretty good. I think it's Asiago.
Descartesianism.